Hey everybody, welcome back to JD Does Dev. I'm JD, and in this video we're going to take on our third customization project. This one's going to be a little bit more involved with a lot more to do, but it's going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and get started. For this section we're going to be trying something a little bit more complicated, but it shows off a lot of the features that Docksal has. So our scenario is that a client wants a decoupled solution to be hosted on two servers. The Drupal side will be hosted on Acquia, and the front-end side will be hosted on a different server. The project is going to use Gatsby.js for the front-end. Now, you could replace Drupal with WordPress and Gatsby with any React or any Node-based front-ends. These are just the words I chose because they're the ones I'm most familiar with. So let's think about what we need for this. Well, we need a Drupal installation on an Acquia stack. Again, you could replace this with WordPress on Automatic or whichever. We're going to need multiple domains. We need two different simulated servers, and we need to be able to connect those servers. We need NodeJS so that our React or Gatsby app can run, NPM or Yarn so that we can get the packages, and Gatsby CLI. So let's dive in and start with our Docker file. We're going to need a custom Docker file for this. So let's go ahead and create a new one. We're going to do this in our services, and since we're calling this Gatsby, we do it in the Gatsby folder. New folder, Gatsby. Then in there, we're going to add Docker file. Now, again, this is pretty empty right now, but we're going to be adding quite a bit in here. So first, what we need to do is say which image we want to use as our base. And the Docksal CLI image is just fine for that. So let's just do that. From CLI PHP version 7.3. Okay. We're going to set our user to Docker so that things are run as the Docker user and not as root. And we want to tell the image that we want our commands to run in bash instead of the default shell. So to do that, we need to tell Docker to build the image that way. To do that, using shell, in bash, this is the executable to bash system, and a C flag, and we're putting that in because we want to make sure that it accepts commands. Now, if you've been following along with the previous sections of this, this next part probably look pretty familiar. I'm going to paste this in. Right, so this is our run command for this image. So set E, this is going to say that we are going to exit if there is a non-zero value returned from any of our commands. 0 is good, anything else means some kind of error. We're going to use our home profile for our user environment, and we're going to install a couple of things. First, we're going to install Node version 10.15.0. and we're going to set that as the default until NVM, which is the Node version manager, use default. Here are a couple packages that we want to install. We're going to install this version of NPM specifically, 6.4.1, and we're going to install Gatsby CLI. Then clear cache, force it, and we're going to get rid of the home config. This is an issue with permission, so we just want to get rid of that one. Next, we want to switch our shell back to standard shell for the user. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it down here. We're going to get rid of that just to say we're in SH. And we want to switch back to our default, to our root user. And finally, we want to tell our image that we're going to be exposing a port. This port is for the development server for Gatsby or any of the Node projects that you might use. and it's port 8000. So we do that by exposing 8000. All right. We're going to save this and close it out for now. We're going to go back to our Docksal YAML file. So what we need to do now is create a custom service. You can see we've already got our normal one, CLI, which is extending the default CLI stack. But we want to add a new one. And just for the sake of using a familiar name, we're going to call it Gatsby. And there are a few things that this needs. In order to function within the application, it needs the host user ID, the host group ID, and the DNS information coming from our host machine. We can pass the host user and group IDs through the environment component, the DNS settings through the DNS component. And what that looks like is this. So we've got our environment component, which has our host UID and host GID, and our Docksal DNS variables are defined in the fin binary, and they're based on the local IP address of the Docksal machine and the remote DNS server, which in this case we're using 8.8.8.8, which is the Google DNS server. Now we need to tell Docksal a little bit more about our service. We're going to do this by defining our host name, the image name, and where to build the image from. And we do that by adding a few more items to our Docksal YAML. We've got our host name, Gatsby. We have our image here, which uses compose project namesafe with the appended Gatsby at the end. And then our build is going to look for the project root folder .docksal/services/Gatsby, and that's where our Docker file lives. Notice we don't need to add in Docker file to the end of that, because it's smart enough to know that's where it should be. We haven't gotten too deep into labels yet. Labels are a special component used by Docker Compose that allow you to change the way that a container works. So we're going to add a couple labels to our service here. And all of our labels, because we're using Docksal, are going to start with io.docksal. Now the default ones that we definitely need here, I'm going to go ahead and paste in. Let's walk through that. We've got io.docksal virtual host equals gatsby.virtualhost. So we're taking the default virtual host, which if you remember back in our docksal.env file, we set that to mycustomsite.docksal. And we're putting the subdomain Gatsby in front of it. We're saying that this service should open the virtual port 8000 and the cert name in case we want to have a local SSH connection or certificate, then we need this in here. If it's set, then we use it. If not, we don't have a certificate name. Now there are a couple more that we need to add in here that allow us to interact with this service a little bit easier. And those are our shell and user labels. So ordinarily, any container except the database and CLI default to the sh shell. So we need to tell Docksal that we want to use bash for this, because a lot of commands may not work the same in sh as they do in bash, and we don't want that. So we're going to add in io.docksal shell equals bash. And then we also want to make sure that we're using the right user within Docker. And that user is going to be Docker. So that way we're not saving things as root. We're not causing any issues there. Now we need to add in a way for the service to store things, or where it should look for files to mount the volume. We're going to do this by using volumes and point specifically to a Gatsby folder. So after the label, put in the volumes information. I'm just going to paste this in because there's a lot of text. All right, so let's go through this a bit. Now, the volumes for this, we're saying that we want project root Gatsby in our host machine to map to var www Gatsby in our container. In this final line, we're passing along our SSH keys, which we have on our host machine, and they're saved through the Docksal SSH agent, and we want them available to our container. If they're available to our container, then we can run commands like git pull or connect to servers from within the container and not have to find a workaround. That's what this is doing. Now, we need a couple final touches to make life a little bit easier. We're going to add an environmental variable that is specific to npm, but it makes things a little bit easier. I'm going to paste this in. Now, by default, it's difficult for Docker and Docksal to tell when there have been file system changes. And if you do any front-end development, you know that you want to run gulp, and often you want it to watch so that your files, when you change CSS or a Sass partial, that it just regenerates it right away. You don't have to go in and type build and do that again. So there's a system in place on Mac called FS notifications. But with the way that Docker mounts and shares work, sometimes the FS notifications don't work. So we use an npm package called Chakadar, and that essentially simulates file system notifications and tells our system that when our Sass partials or whichever are changing, that we rebuild it. So we're just adding in this variable to say, hey, Chakadar, check it out, and watch for file changes. And we're also going to add in working directory. Now, the working directory makes it easier for us to run commands in our container. And it does that by saying, if we were to run finexec in Gatsby or fin bash Gatsby, then it would by default try to run everything in the www folder. So in there instead. But we want it to run things within the Gatsby folder, which is where all of our front-end app lives. That's what this is for. Now we have a couple more things to do, but this is our Gatsby service. Now we have a couple more things to do, but right now we finished out our Gatsby service right here. Got quite a bit going on here, but now it'll spin up the service using our custom Docker file, pass in our environmental variables, decide which folder we want to run commands in, so DNS works, give it a shell and a user to use, and we have a volume set up. But this only works for our Node project. So when we run Gatsby develop, or if you're using React, if you just run whatever command to spin up your React app in develop mode where it watches for changes and doesn't actually build out anything, you know that the project is running on the Node server as opposed to a static site or an Apache instance. So we don't yet have our second web server, but we want that. So we're going to create yet another service in our Docksal YAML. We're going to call this one Gatsby Web. I'm going to head down to a new line and make sure we've got the indentation right. And name our service. Now for this, we don't need the full CLI. All we need is Apache. So we're going to add Apache. And this is saying that we're just going to look in our registry for the Docksal Apache 2.4.2.3. And then we're also going to attach our volume, which is going to be exactly the same as our volume up here. Since we're not going to be interacting with outside services like GitHub or anything that might require our SSH key, we're not going to worry about copying this line down. We've got our volume attached, and now we need to set an environment variable that's going to tell Apache where the doc root of our project is. Otherwise, it's going to default to var www doc-root. So let's add that in environment section. What this is doing is setting that environmental variable, and we're saying that we want this web server to look at var www Gatsby public, which is where the build will be for our project. Finally, we want to assign the domain for this service. So let's add in a label. Now this looks a lot like what we did up in this one, but instead we're calling it static because this is going to be the fully built end result after we've run whatever command to build out our project and have it ready for deployment. So we're just going to call it static. What we aren't going to cover in this is building a full decoupled project. But we can test this pretty easily. And we can do that by creating a Gatsby folder, not within doc-root, but outside of it. Open up our terminal here, make sure we're in the right place. And to the Gatsby folder, and remember we're looking in the public folder, so make the public directory, go in there. Now we're just going to make a quick HTML file in here. Save that, save our YAML file. Let's run fin up. I'm going to pause it here and we'll come back after everything is loaded up. Okay, so we finished up and it took about 2 minutes, or it took close to 3 minutes, 2 minutes 41 seconds. I'm going to scroll back up and take a look at some of the things that happened here. So we ran fin up and we started the services. So it says building Gatsby. That's our service, came straight from our Docksal YAML file. And we looked at what image we're using. So that image was our new Docker file. It started running the commands from the Docker file. We're using from Docksal CLI, setting the user Docker, changing the shell, going through and doing all the commands. Now, one of those commands is install, npm install, all these things. So we got some warnings just saying deprecated packages because I'm using an older version for this example. Then it ran the Gatsby CLI installer, a little more npm warnings. Then finally, we get down here where it creates our new services. Docksal Training Projects Gatsby and Gatsby Web. Wait for the stack to become ready, and then here we are. Gives us our project URL. So let's go ahead and take a look and see if it worked. Go back to the browser, and this is our Drupal side, my custom site Docksal. We'll give it a second to load up. And then we also have static.mycustomsite.docksal. And there we go. This is our Apache server running in a different service. This is our Apache server for Drupal running in its own service. And they're running together in our project. So let's go on back to our editor. And a couple things we can try out here. So there's a command fin bash, which lets you use the terminal within a container. By default, it goes to your CLI container. So if I run that now, see we're Docker at CLI. Take a look in here. We've got our index.html file. And we can go back and see all of our other files here for our full project. Now, if we wanted to specify that we want to go into the Gatsby container, which is where our node project lives, you run fin bash Gatsby, and it tells you, hey, Now we're in this Gatsby folder. Just write in Gatsby. Got our public folder. But look here, we go up folder and we have nothing but Gatsby and the HTML folder. That's because this is a completely different service and we didn't mount our entire project folder. We just mounted the Gatsby one. So we can run commands in here just like we were running them on any computer to either create files, remove files, add in packages, what have you. And it works. So it's really easy to go in. We want to make some changes within the container itself. If we want to change, for example, our -rc and add in a couple custom commands or custom path variables in there, we can do it. Pretty easy. What we've done here is we've created a custom Docker file that pulls off of an existing image and builds from that. We've installed a few utilities for Node, npm, Gatsby CLI, and then we've also created a couple new services. Got our Gatsby Node service, which is only used for running Node and building the application. And we've also created our Gatsby web service, which is an Apache image that serves our static page. And overall, it went pretty well. So that just shows how customizable and configurable Docksal can be for your projects. You can really recreate just about anything on your local development environment by just editing a few lines of code. In the next section, we're going to look at using local files so that we can add credentials and other information that we may not want to put into a version control repository or GitHub repo or Bitbucket, whatever you use. So check out the next one. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this video. There's a little bit more to it than the previous ones, but it was a lot of fun to put together. So thanks for sticking with it. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments down below. And if you don't mind, go ahead and click that like button and that subscribe button. And if there's anything else that you'd like to see me cover, feel free to reach out. Be more than happy to give it a shot. Thanks again. I'm JD, and this is JD Does Dev.